So first, I'd like to see if the panelists have questions for each other. Putting you on the spot.
Maybe we
okay. If not, okay,
continue with question for the others.
Okay. No questions over there.
Hi there. I have a question for Francesca. Your speak was very interesting, and the idea of smart machines obviously has a lot of benefits to it, but I was wondering of the implications on a larger stance. On a larger stance, looking at the implications going all the way to childhood, especially just looking at, sorry, I'm re-looking at my notes that I wrote. Okay. Just from the common notion that we learn from our mistakes. And so the idea that we are constantly, understanding that this technology is going to be implemented in society in a much larger aspect than we're simply talking about in medical or other infrastructure. Once this becomes a much more social environment that children are going to be interact with, the notion that there's a constant companion who is suggesting and telling us and teaching us what is the right and wrong things to do in every situation, it seems like there is a lack of our own personal development. And then I think that also begs the question on a larger conversation about originality and creativity. And if we do have these companions who are talking to us and suggesting based on an algorithm in which they are constantly developing, I am very curious about what your thoughts are in innovations and even artwork, and who is the owner of this idea. And also, sorry, one more thing is that, okay, yeah.
Okay, I think that's a very interesting question, and I don't have many answers, but I certainly see the danger if one brings this approach to the extreme, that everybody, including children, are going to be accompanied in their life, in their decision by some support system. Then, of course, there is a danger that creativity, learning by mistakes, and originality becomes a bit. But first of all, each one of these systems, I envision it as being personalized, so not the same for everybody. And second, I mean, it really brings again the this fact that I think that this whole, once we have in mind a certain vision as AI people, it's really a multidisciplinary approach. So psychologists, that know how children, evolve, can help us understand and mitigate those and possibly not have those negative effects, and help us understand if there is in the future a different way of growing up, of building our own, identity, which possibly is different from what we have now. I mean, I think that people, children that grow up now, they grow up in a very different environment, and they grow up in a very different way from when I grew up, when I was a child. Is this good or bad? I don't know. I mean, I think that there are experts not in AI, but in other disciplines that can help us understand the implications of what we do and of our visions that we can implement, but then, the implications should be taken into account. So thank you for this question.
Yeah, I had a few minor comments here. I mean, one of the more bizarre scenarios of how the AIs take over, so to speak, is that we have all these auto-suggestion things about, like we have autocompletes as we type things in. It's like the AI knows our, I'm a person who happens to collect a lot of data on myself. I've probably collected more data on myself than any other human, kind of bizarrely. And so I have all this personal analytics information. And so automated systems should be able to predict for me, what I should do. They may know better than me what I should do. And there may come a time when there's just a bunch of auto-suggestions that are coming up saying, you should take a drink of water now, you should do this, you should do that. Just like we follow our car GPSs, I think it is extremely likely that most of us will follow most of those auto-suggestions because they'll probably be pretty good suggestions. And I think that's kind of the soft way that kind of the AIs take over, so to speak. First comment. Second comment is about creativity and so on. I think that people have this view that, the deterministic underlying system, the programmed system doesn't show originality and creativity. I think this is just not true. Good example of this, we made a thing many years ago called Wolfram tones. It was during the cell phone ringtone craze. It still exists. You can go look at it on the web. It's a thing that generates music using simple cellular automata. And it basically goes out into the computational universe and it tries to find, it has heuristics to decide, this is a hip-hop sounding cellular automaton or something. And it searches, each cellular automaton is kind of interesting because it has a kind of an inner logic. It's like it's not just random noise, it has an idea underneath it, and that's sort of rendered in music, okay? So I thought, well, this is kind of an amusing thing, nobody's going to care about it. Turns out I run into all sorts of composers who say, I thought, a computer can take the idea of a composer and render it. But instead what I hear from composers is, that's kind of a cool site that I go to get sort of creative ideas from which I then build a whole structure. And so the computer in that case is providing the creative spark, which is sort of a strange thing. My third quick comment perhaps is about this question about people learning, what the children of the future will learn and how, people learn from the sort of what civilization has built up and the environment that we have built for ourselves and the natural world that exists. It's sort of interesting to see as we see how kind of there are, in the sort of computational universe of possibilities, there's a lot of stuff that isn't realized by the natural world, certainly isn't realized by our civilization as it now exists. And it's sort of interesting to imagine what, as we get to explore more of that kind of computational universe, how our patterns of thought change considerably. And that's true, for example, in this sort of emergent concepts that arise in the insides of neural networks and so on.
Great. So we've got a lot of questions. I'm going to prioritize people who haven't spoken. So, you first.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ashok. No academic affiliation. Throughout this conference, and Dr. Wolfram and Dr. Rossi both mentioned rule-based systems for ethics. It strikes me that in human justice systems, the great majority of the brain power is spent on specific cases, thinking through the details of the different ethical principles that might apply. And rarely do we see humans spend nearly as much time coming up with rules, even to the extent of fancy legal jargon, getting very specific. So my question for you guys, and I know Mr. Wolfram mentioned this a little bit, talking about sensors and smart contracts, but how do we actually do the complex work of judging individual cases across different sort of ethical principles, especially in the context of the fact that most humans have a very pluralistic and often contradictory system of ethics?
I can try taking that. I think my view of what's possible is to take, existing laws and render them in some kind of symbolic form. Now, laws of different countries, different jurisdictions, and so on, they're going to disagree. Now, the question, when you say, let's make a contract, I think there's a famous case about chickens, as I recall, about a contract where somebody got a kind of chicken that wasn't the kind of chicken they thought they were going to get. And the question is, when you make a contract and you say, I'm going to get this type of chicken and it's described in this way, in today's world, it's a bunch of English words that say, or words in some natural language that say what the chicken is supposed to be like. In the world of the future, I would imagine it's much more that both parties will agree this machine learning system trained in this way will be the thing that decides whether it's that kind of chicken or that other kind of chicken. And I think that if both parties agree that that's what the contract is defined by this code that is this machine learning system that is going to distinguish chickens or whatever. I think I see that as being you can agree, both parties can agree the code is going to determine what happens. This is a longer question, and I'm not sure I got quite the import of what you were saying.
So last question. Who has the mic? Yeah, Gina.
So there's a question. Is this thing on? It's hard to tell. Okay,
Yeah.
thank you. There's a question for the whole panel, and it's about the way people today have been using the words we and our to talk about our values and things like that. And I'm wondering if that assumes a sort of commonality to human ethics that is maybe false. So what I have in mind here is the view many theorists have that Western European ethical traditions coming out of the Enlightenment are a sort of historical aberration, focusing on the individual, whereas in contrast, say, Sub-Saharan African ethics or East Asian ethics focus on communal harmony. If all of that's right then, and this has real implications for AI ethics and in questions like privacy and autonomy, so if all that's right, if that's a reasonable worry, I'm wondering what you think. Is it necessary before we come up with AI ethics that we seek some sort of convergence, some sort of agreement, global agreement on intercultural ethics, or do we just accept that AI moralities will develop independently in different pockets of the world where the money and the technology is there, and that in fact AI ethics are actually going to diverge and there'll be different ethical systems implemented in different machines?
Well, one reason for emphasizing something like an empathy mechanism is that it's a way of trying to get moral behavior, or functionally moral behavior, that isn't mediated by a higher order moral theory of a particular kind. And so therefore it can serve as a kind of constraint on how individuals interact, even when they have different moral theories. So this is also relevant to the question about how much rules matter. The suggestion would be that intelligent systems could be capable of spontaneous adjustment to each other's preferences, each other's values, looking at those under greater conditions of greater information, and adjusting their behavior in a way that can be mutually beneficial for them. And that doesn't require that we think we've got the right set of values right now. It requires that we think we could benefit from working together.
One comment perhaps on this. If you look at the world today, right, there's 7 billion people divided into roughly 200 countries. There's a question, can we, if we knew sort of the technology, communication mechanisms and so on of the world, can we on the back of an envelope derive that 7 billion people will organize themselves into roughly 200 countries? It's kind of a scary thing. We recently got data on sort of all historical country borders. There are about, I think, 1,300 sort of countries that have existed in history, roughly, from historical atlases and so on. And you look at an animation of how the countries of the world have evolved over time. And it looks just like something, soap bubbles popping and things, empire gets bigger, eventually it pops and so on. It's a funny process that I don't think we understand. But I think I have to say that the idea that we're going to have the one magic sort of AI constitution that governs them all, I don't see that, because I think this constitution has to be a reflection of our human values and so on, and we don't all have quite the same values, and I don't think we can. And I think that's, that would be my point of view on that.
Yeah, I definitely agree that there's never going to be one set of values, and maybe the long-term, vision is that we will adjust and, adjust to the fact that we don't have the same values, but we can interact, and we find it advantageous to, have an interaction with shared values. But also in the short term, I think there will be some things, some tasks where there is no set of universal values. So depending on the specific scenarios that you're going to consider, you will have values that are useful and in that particular task and scenario. But there will be other things like even self-driving cars, where even now with normal cars, not self-driving cars, even now, of course, there are different social norms and different ways of driving all over the world, but to sell a car that can be sold all over the world, you have to pass a certain threshold of safety constraints. And all the cars have to pass that threshold. And then, you can improve on one or another aspect, but all the cars have to pass a certain threshold. So I think that in the future, all the self-driving cars will have to pass a certain threshold, which can be tested or, explained or, evaluated in some way. And then things can be different from one to another one. So in that scenario, I see the need for a basic universality for lower, low threshold of basic values which are shared. But in another scenarios, I see very specific, values in each.
Can I just
Great.
say one totally bizarre point? I just
Go ahead.
for fun. I mean, this question of sort of what the future of civilization is, and we've got all these entities, which let's say they're sort of disembodied souls in our kind of box of 1 trillion souls, or a box of. So there's this kind of a funny thing, because when you have entities like that that can replicate in arbitrary numbers, this question of how where you get these kind of clumps of common values gets very weird, because we humans seem to like communities where there are multiple ones of us, so to speak. We don't just want to be one human on our own, but it's a kind of a funny thing to think about. When you can expand without bound, and yet you have to make clumps to make things meaningful. How that works, and it kind of gets one into kind of thinking about transfinite numbers of souls and so on, and let's not go there.
So, well, let's thank all the panelists for a really wonderful discussions. Thank you all for coming. That was a great first day, and we'll see you again tomorrow.